Thank you, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Hassan Ben Imran, who's a board member at the Law For Palestine organization and an author on Palestine, Israel, and international law. And he joins us today from Istanbul, Turkey. Hassan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's a pleasure to join you.
So I'd like to start off first with the elephant in the room with regards to the ongoing genocide being perpetrated by Israel, the issue of quote unquote self-defense, because on its face, it's an absurd argument because it would be like bombing an entire city because somebody bumped into you at a bar. But for the sake of argument, let's look at Article 51 of the UN Charter, which Israel invoked, and it refers to a state's right to self-defense when attacked by another state. But as Francesca Albanese, the UN rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, put it, Israel's never been threatened by a state, but rather, quote, an armed group within an occupied territory. And just going by international law, as I understand it, there is no right to self-defense when you are an occupying force. Could you expound a little bit on this?
Of course. So to basically start the discussion, before we talk about Israel's right to self-defense, it's quite interesting for me that most of the discussions, I'm not talking about this particular discussion, but the international media discussion, the mainstream media discussion, starts with the speaker note about Israel's rights, as if Israel is that innocent, cute, weak entity looking for rights, looking for someone to protect them, forgetting that this is a nuclear power. It claims to be the strongest army in the Middle East, stronger than the huge surrounding armies. It does claim to be the most powerful power in the Middle East, stronger than Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. This is what Israel claims. So I find it quite mind-provoking that the conversation in mainstream media always starts with Israel's right, whether to self-defense or to anything else. But for the sake of the conversation, as you said, Eleanor, we can discuss what the law says about it. Francesca Albanese, Dr. Francesca, put it in a very good way that about Israel. But it was not only Francesca, and it's not a new discussion. It's not a discussion that started this year or in the past previous operations. We have an ICJ advisory opinion that was issued back in 2004 on the advisory opinion on the wall. It clearly said in paragraph 139, and anyone would like to refer to it, please feel free to do so while watching this one, where it clearly talks about that Israel, while being the occupying power, does not enjoy the rights conveyed upon states by Article 51 of the UN Charter. So Israel does not enjoy the right to self-defense to a territory it occupies. Let us break it down. So why is that the case? So when you are an occupying power, what does that mean? You are in a state of offense. You are actively taking an active part in moving your military forces or using your cards of power, let's say, because it's not just military forces, like the electricity, the water, the maritime boundaries, so on and so forth. So you are in an active state of offense. And I'm not talking about the legality of it. Now we'll come to the legality of it. So this means that you are already in the offense. You're taking the initiative. Self-defense is a reactionary thing. It's something that you do in response to something that happens to you. So that's not the case in the case of Israel. But according to international law, according to the ICJ, which is the most authoritative judiciary on earth, there's no dispute about that. It's the court of the UN or the World Court. So we have that. Now we have the other advisory opinion, which is being deliberated at the moment, following the UN Commission of Inquiry back in 2022. The commission said that the Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories is illegal in and of itself. So what does that mean? That means that Israeli occupation is not illegal because of its conduct, which is illegal, but it's not because of the conduct. It's because of the very fact that Israel is occupying the Palestinian territories. The former special rapporteur set very clear four criteria for an occupation to be illegal. It's published on Israel Talk. I think perhaps you can add it to the caption of the conversation. And the court right now is deliberating on this particular, before the ICJ case started, it was already deliberating on the legality of the occupation itself. Now, this is supposed to end the dispute once and for all. In my opinion, the occupation started to be illegal, did not turn out to be illegal, but regardless, it is illegal right now in and of itself, which means you definitely cannot claim the right to self-defense. You cannot speak of rights because you are in a state of aggression, not just a state of offense, a state of active aggression. So whatever, because now, if let's say the Israeli occupation deprives Israel of the right to self-defense, that means Israel might be entitled, according to international law, and now I'm talking within a gray zone, a gray area, might be entitled to some measures to repel certain hostilities on its own territories. I mean, that would be the case. Now that we speak of an illegal occupation in and of itself, then you absolutely strip them of any claims to rights. So let's, for the sake of the conversation, let's think of it like this. Now we have Russia and Ukraine. It's a clear case where everyone is talking about some reason, like our history chose Ukraine to happen right before this Gaza war, to expose many things that have been beautified, or many people are trying to beautify them or change that impact. But they happened in such a very close time frame for people everywhere to see the hypocrisy, I would say, while dealing with these matters. And we can get into this further on later on. So let's say that Ukraine, now everyone is talking about the Russian occupation to be illegal in and of itself, because Russia is in a state of aggression. That's the international legal debate on it. So now let's say that Ukraine attacks the Russian territories that are the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia. Now everyone is going to say, of course, Ukraine is entitled to it. I haven't heard another dispute. What if Ukraine takes further step into the Russian territories to make sure that you see where I'm going with this? So basically, the discussion, once you remove the word Palestine and you remove the word Israel, the discussion is already settled. It's because of the titles we add to them that we have a legal dispute about them. As simple as that. So moving on from here, from the right to self-defense and from the advisory opinion, I believe, just to conclude, I believe the discussion on mainstream media should start with what are Israel's responsibilities, because it is the occupying power. It has been the occupying power for ages, for decades, and above all, it is the capable side in this conflict. It is a nuclear power. Just any military analyst, I don't know if you have hosted any military analyst, to just make a quick comparison between what the Palestinians have of all factions, including the PA, and what Israel has. Any military analyst would tell you this is a joke. I mean, why are we saying comparison? I mean, yeah, so I'll end here about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the how the mainstream media, or corporate media as we call it here, calls it a war. That suggests that there are two sides that are somehow evenly matched, which is absolutely not the case. So even just to call it a war, I feel is very misleading. And I do want to get into more conversations about the ICJ, but I also want to talk about something that the corporate media misses entirely. I mean, it misses almost everything, but something that has not come up a lot, even in some alternative media, is talk of the West Bank, because most of the focus, understandably, has been on Gaza, but there's quite a lot of ramping up of violence happening in the West Bank as well, that's just basically passing under the radar in terms of the push to blockade, to further displace Palestinians and throw up settlements. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on in the past couple of months here, and how Israel seems to be using this time when everybody's focused on Gaza to perpetuate this violence in the West Bank?
Yeah. For many reasons, Israeli behavior seems to prioritize alienating Gaza, like getting rid of the problem of Gaza, or as Rabin said it very clearly, he said, "I wish the sea swallows Gaza." Isaac Rabin, the Nobel Prize winner. So he clearly said that I wish the sea swallows Gaza, for a simple reason, that the moment that Israel is done with Gaza, it wants to reclaim the whole land and territory and holy sites of the West Bank. Israel has one simple problem when it comes to the West Bank. It has some Palestinians. For some reason, this problem existed for Israel. So this has to be resolved. But in order to resolve it, you need to finish one by one. You need to end the problem of Gaza and then focus on the West Bank. Now, some people say that this is something that happened with the right-wing government, starting from Netanyahu and before that, Ariel Sharon. Well, if we look at the numbers, the whole process started in 1967, Israelizing the West Bank, annexing the territory, starting from East Jerusalem and to the rest of the West Bank, the Jordan Valley. Then it accelerated massively following the Oslo Accords. While Palestinians, and while Yasser Arafat was being blamed for being the bad guy who does not want to negotiate peace and who's being stubborn, ultra stubborn, to give up further of the remaining 18% of the territory of the Mandate Palestine. While he was being accused of that, Israel has been massively accelerating the pace of settlements during the left-wing Labor government. So this is not something about the right wing of Israel. Linking it with the right wing, I think, is a distraction for many reasons. Then the process with Netanyahu became worse. So I'm not saying that they are equally bad or they have been equally bad at treating Palestinians. Definitely, Netanyahu has made it much worse, but it has started way before Netanyahu. Netanyahu continued a path that has been started by others. The situation got worse and worse until you had this current new government. And I'm not just talking about this formation of the government. I'm talking about the few years, the latest governments. You had an extreme fascist-minded government with people like Smotrich, Ben Gvir, who are publicly talking about genocide. Netanyahu has spoken about it, but they're kind of more comfortable talking about it. Like Netanyahu seems to have a legal team. They don't seem to have a legal team. They seem just to be speaking out their mind. So the process became very evident to the extent that now we're talking about a state within a state. There is an Israeli state, then there is an Israeli sub-state formed by the settlers. It's kind of disorganized, but also organized. It is connected to the state and independent from the state. Connected in the sense that they are being fully armed by the state of Israel, the government, and by Ben Gvir. And this is not something that needs any analysis. Just Google Ben Gvir providing heavy artillery to settlers in the West Bank. So now you're talking about a state within a state. And now when I talk with any Israeli affairs specialist or expert, whether an Israeli, a Palestinian Israeli, or anyone who specializes in this field, they tell me that there is not a single Israeli leader who dares to dismantle the settlements. Everyone talks about an Israeli civil war if anyone dares to dismantle the settlements. What does that mean? That means that Israel has zero interest in giving anything when it comes to the territory of the West Bank, which was a part of the territory of the Mandate Palestine. If we go back to the 1939, I refer to the followers to read something called the White Paper of 1939, where the government of Great Britain promised to establish a state in Palestine, one state in Palestine called Palestine for the whole citizens of the territory. Palestinians being Muslims, Christians, or Jews. So it was a state for everyone. And if you look at the coin, it had two languages, Arabic and Hebrew, and of course English, since the UK was being the mandate over Palestine. So of course the UK did not fulfill, it broke its promises, violated its obligations. If there is an independent judiciary to look into this one, definitely the UK government, the government of Great Britain would be indicted. And here I refer anyone who's interested in this one to read further about it from John Quigley, an American professor of international law, who has written, regularly has been writing about this one, and he published recently a book called The British Mandate, talking in details about that the UK did not simply violate the League of Nations, the whole act was in violation of the principles of the League of Nations back then. So now back to the current situation. We're talking about a state within a state that is being fully armed by the state of Israel, and that is not subject directly to the Israeli judiciary. In the West Bank, people are subject to different military judiciary. Like the Israelis are subject to one law, the Palestinians are subject to another law. However, those in the West Bank, they kind of have a free card, a free pass, get out of jail in Monopoly. That type of card. They're not accountable in any possible way. So in my opinion, what's happening in Gaza is a rehearsal for what could be happening in the West Bank, if not worse. Because from many perspectives, religious, strategic, and many other perspectives, for some reason, the West Bank is the focus for annexation. They don't want to annex Gaza, they just want Gaza out of the equation. How? Gazans can go to Congo, as per the latest news, they can go to Rwanda. I mean, they figure it out. Sinai is too big, go to the desert, do something there. So they just want to get rid of Gaza. They don't necessarily need that territory per se. Now they want, because of greed and arrogance, but historically they did not want per se to annex Gaza, but they did want to swallow the whole territory of the West Bank. So I would conclude about this, that what is happening in the West Bank is not a random disorganized action. Yes, the settlers are not as organized as the Israeli military, the Israeli armed forces, but it is being commissioned somehow by the state of Israel. The connections are deeper and older than Ben Gvir, but with Ben Gvir, the pace of acceleration has become very evident and too clear.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for contextualizing that. That sounds absolutely horrifying to think that the West Bank could also look like Gaza soon. But with regards to kind of shifting back now to the ICJ, I want to turn to South Africa's filing of a genocide case against Israel. And first of all, I know that some listeners have noted that they're confused between the ICJ and the ICC. So I just want to say, and you probably have far more to say about this, but the ICJ is part of the UN. And as such, like the UN, has no enforcement mechanism. The ICC is an international court seated at The Hague, Netherlands, and has historically, since its founding in 1998, which is not that long ago, been a colonial court focused on crimes against humanity almost exclusively in Africa by non-white perpetrators. Of the 51 defendants currently listed on the ICC's site, only 2 are not African. It does have the power to arrest, but the US, for instance, has made it clear, not least of all with the Hague Invasion Act, that's what it's called colloquially, that it will, quote, use all means necessary and appropriate to bring about the release of a US or allied person detained or imprisoned by the ICC, end quote. So with that in mind, as we look at what's going on with the ICJ, I'm curious. I mean, the US can just shrug it off, like it shrugs off everything the UN says. And of course, Israel can do the same because it has the backing of the United States. And if it does somehow move to the ICC, it seems that the US could also just shrug it off because it's ready to invade the Netherlands, which is just absurd to think about, but that's the world we live in. So I'm curious, with those 2 judicial mechanisms, what are your thoughts on these cases?
Yep. So to break it down, I'll come at the end for to discuss the Hague Invasion Act, which is so surreal. Like it feels like a scene from some movie. So to break it down, now we're talking about the limits, or let's say the challenges to the UN system, to the court, in terms of application, enforcement of its decision. We also have the issue of the US pressure, American pressure on the UN, on its court, blocking certain resolutions. And we have the issue of what do we expect from the court of the UN, considering the limitations that we're speaking of. Now, we can talk in details about the colonialist foundation of international law. I mean, it's not too difficult to dig deeper into. We can just, for example, we started the discussion by talking about the right to self-defense, right? Now, I have a tiny question, like a simple question. Why do we have such a well-coded resolution or article, very well-coded, very heavily documented, codified, and clarified in the international legal regime, which is called the right to self-defense, which is a right for states? And now when we say states, basically we're talking about the states that were in existence when the UN was founded in 1948. And they happen to be from certain geographical zone, not from different countries all over the world. So while 70% of the world was colonized at that time, nobody spoke about the right of people to defend themselves, self-defense for people. I mean, why is that? Even though, morally speaking, the right to self-defense of people, to be honest, in my opinion, I don't want to sound a bit like, but it's more of an obligation. If someone attacks my house, attacks my kids, what kind of a father am I if I don't protect them? I mean, why is it called a right? This is an obligation. I will find it very difficult to morally respect someone that runs away, a father, a mother, anyone that would run away from protecting their kids, because, I mean, it's a very commonsensical thing to think about. However, this was not codified, the right of people to self-defense. Look at the British discourse about the Mau Mau revolution in Kenya, for instance. While Kenyans were being very softly and gently genocided back then, they created conservatories for Kenyans to put them. So basically, they didn't want to kill the like the British were less aggressive in their colonialism than the French. The French like, genocided like in broad daylight the people of many cities in Algeria. I'm trying to remember the name of the city where 40,000 people were genocided in one day by the French power. The British were I'm talking about the government of Great Britain back then. They were more gentle, more soft. So basically, they wanted to do business in East Africa, basically Uganda and Kenya. They didn't want to kill people. They just want to do business. However, there is a tiny problem: is that there are people in this land. So how do we come across this problem? We just create conservatories. So if you go to Kenya right now, you have something called Masai Mara, which is a conservatory for wild animals. Basically, they created the same for the Gikuyu tribes, massive tribes, for them to stay in certain conservatories where they do not bother the business conduct of the government of Great Britain back then. So we can talk in details about the foundations, the colonialist foundations international. However, we can acknowledge that there are many moral foundations for the current international legal regime. It's imperfect, it is very flawed, but it has certain moral foundations. It has certain things that people commonsensically agree on. The fact that there is a court for the UN in itself is an achievement. However, the problem is everyone made sure that this court is not given any enforcement powers. So in a local context, in a state context, you have the government, the executive body, you have the judiciary, you have the parliament, and you have the checks and balance system to make sure that everyone does not transgress or the other. And let's say if the judiciary makes a decision based on, let's say, a legislation coming from the parliament, who is going to implement this one? It's very clear, the police, the executive. They will implement this resolution. In the international legal system, it's much more complicated than that. The body that was supposed to have certain executive powers is the UN Security Council, and for some reason, it's paralyzed. Now we're talking about the veto power, which was mainly in this context. In the context of Palestine, we're talking about the US activating the veto powers whenever they feel like it. As simple as that. I did see that the UN, the American envoy to the UNSC, when he voted against the ceasefire, I did see his hand shaking. I don't know if that was caught by many people, but his hand was shaking. He knew what they were doing back then, right there. So to talk about this one, the ICJ, or going to the ICJ, South Africa going to the ICJ, in my opinion, is a very historical, a historical important milestone in the legal pursuit of accountability for Palestinians. There are many challenges, but the act in itself is a brave act from South Africa. It's a necessary one, and it's the first time something of this scale happens. What do we expect from the court? After the hearing, I would be very surprised if the court does not issue provisional measures. And provisional measures, it's something similar to interim measures in local law, like restraining order. It's a temporary measure or temporary order issued by the court on the basis of plausibility, not existence of merits. So the court would not say that a genocide has happened or is happening. The court would say that it is plausible, it is thinkable, imaginable that there could be a genocide happening. So in light of this, the war has to be ended. The genocide has to be ended without calling it a genocide based on merits, because this is an initial interim measure. So I find it very unlikely that the court will not issue that, despite American and Israeli pressure. The moment this is over, we will get into discussing the merits and the case law and characterization of the crimes, the facts on the ground, and the law, what the law says, based on the jurisprudence of the court, building on the Yugoslavia court, Rwanda court, and the ICJ case in Myanmar, and the former case of Bosnia versus Serbia. So there will be a long legal process and to go through right there. I would think, and this is what Francis Boyle said, who was the first lawyer to get a decision by the ICJ on genocide. He said, I do see this case succeeding. I do see South Africa succeeding in getting a judgment, a binding judgment, which is binding on the UN Security Council, the UN, and state parties, the US and Israel, and others as well. A binding judgment on genocide, not just failure to prevent, not just incitement, not just failure to stop the incitement, but also perpetration of genocide. So it's even more than what has been judged against Serbia back then in the case. There was a bit of complexity regarding Srebrenica, and if you're familiar with the Bosnian context, Bosnia was made up of 3 territories: the Croatian Bosnia, the Republika Srpska, which is the Serbian entity within Bosnia, which was genociding the Bosniaks, who are the Muslim ethnic Bosniaks of Bosnia, the Bosnians, basically. When we say the word, we mainly refer to the Bosniaks. So the court only indicted the Republika Srpska and did not indict Serbia directly, but indicted them for failure to prevent the genocide. However, in this case, we're going to talk about Israel being fully indicted and the US probably indicted for failing to prevent an Israeli genocide. Now, someone would say, but you know, the Israel and the US are 2 independent countries. All of a sudden, this discussion is going to surface at some point. Here, the court would be discussing something related to the capacity of the US to prevent the Israeli genocide, not how interrelated the governments are. So does the US have the capacity to prevent Israel from committing this genocide? Well, we could talk about the aid. I mean, that's the simplest way to start this conversation. I think it will be easily proven that the US could prevent the Israeli leadership from perpetrating this genocide. So that's the ICJ case. That's how the case would naturally go. Now we will move to the US pressure, which is the main reason why everyone would think that the case might not go through and might at some point, you know, something might happen. Now there are many scenarios. The first scenario, which is the natural one, is that the court continues just like it did in every other cases, and the decision, the judgments were respected. The court, the ICJ, has such a prestige and respect that most of its decisions were respected, even against some veto powers like the UK, etc. So the decisions of the ICJ are generally respected. However, now we might be talking about, so the first scenario is that it will be respected. The second scenario would be that the pressure, the American pressure, might be massive on the court in a way to obstruct their work. I don't see this as the most major likelihood. It is possible, but I would say if a decision of this nature comes out, I wouldn't be surprised to see the US acting in ways that we would have considered unimaginable, like cutting funds to the UN and just having the UN. They might. I mean, you have something called the Hague Invasion Act, which, by the way, when I first heard about it, I thought it's a joke. I thought my friend is you know, back then in the days, I thought it's like, you know, someone is just, you know, that sort of fake news where people create memes out of. But then I was going through it and I was like, this is serious. I mean, how can that be serious? I mean, but so we might be talking about scenarios of this sort. What I would say is that this judgment is important on many levels. On the level of the remedies, the reparations, the justice that can be served to the Palestinian victims, but also it will have impact on the whole international legal regime and system, which would have impact on the international political order in many ways. This case is, I think, is a milestone. I don't want to be exaggerating, but I think we're talking about an unusual precedent in the international legal system, something that has never happened before.
So
That's what I think. Yeah.
Just really quickly about that. So let's say hypothetically that that this moves forward and the US respects the outcome of this. What would then be the ramifications against Israel and the US, and what could Palestinians expect from the UN?
Yep. So South Africa listed down in its relief sought section. It's called relief sought by South Africa. It listed 9 requests or like demands from the court. The first one is that it declares Israel has committed the genocide. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Israel will be responsible, will be accountable, and the leaders will be brought to justice by the ICJ. The third one is reparation, so on and so forth. So it's basically a full judgment, binding judgment that includes punishment, not just moral, let's say, moral decision to uphold the rights of the victims, but it will have direct materialistic or material repercussions and consequences on the state of Israel and its current leadership. But the judgment will be on the state of Israel. Unlike the ICC, it's not on the individuals, it's on the state as a state with its full capacity, which means that everyone who had a part in this genocide will be questioned. So this would include people, for instance, like journalists, like the doctors who signed 100, the 100 doctors who signed a letter to ask for the hospitals of Gaza. So I mean, so I would say that the US pressure is a given. It's gonna happen. It's already happening. However, I doubt that the court would be as politicized as the ICC. The ICC is very politicized for clear reasons, starting from the British involvement in appointing the current prosecutor and the deals this prosecutor struck with many leaders who were accused before the ICC and they were dropped. That's another discussion. I think the court, there are grounds to believe that the court would professionally proceed with this case and go on the whole way till the end. But there are also grounds to believe that there is pressure. However, I am someone who's practical minded. I am a realist when I read the situation, but I am practical minded when it comes to what can be done. We can talk about how the world is messed up, since I'm trying to watch my language. I can't, like, we can talk about the imbalance of power, all of these problems. However, does that mean you should sit down and do nothing? I would like to do something. So I would think of what could be done. So when I start doing this, we humans, before we do something, we like to see what others have done, right? Because our imagination is controlled by we're imprisoned by our sights or our experiences in a way or another. So before we do something, we want to see, like, did my cousin manage to do it? So yeah, if my cousin did, that means it's possible. So let's look at it on the international level. Now we're talking about Palestine, trying to get some justice. Palestine having the US, almost the whole of Europe, not the whole of Europe, but the major countries in the EU standing by the side of Israel, arming Israel, voting against ceasefire in the UN, so on and so forth. So what would be possible to do within this scenario? Then here I would refer to Namibia, or more clearly to South Africa, since for some reason, history was very interesting that South Africa was the one to stand up for Palestine, the country that really knows the meaning of what Palestinians are going through. So now think about it. Who was supporting South Africa? The very same countries that are supporting Israel, almost by name. So they were supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa, the racist apartheid regime. Nobody saw it possible that the South Africans, the non-Dutch or the non-white majority, would be able at some point to rule their country, or at least to be treated like humans with little rights. Nobody saw it as a possible outcome. And when I was discussing this with some of the drafters of the Constitution, with some of the chief of the Constitutional Assembly, everyone would say, like, this was more of a hypothetical. It's like we're watching a movie. We're saying, like, will it go this way? Like Lord of the Rings, I like to see it, but like maybe this. It's something of this nature. Nobody thought it is a feasible thing. However, because of so many factors, including the international legal pressure through the international legal movement, and for some reason, the very same international legal movement that was fighting for South Africa is now fighting for Palestine. And you can look at the legal team of South Africa. Many of them were fighting against the apartheid, and now they are the legal team to fight for Palestine. I think it's something worth noticing. Now, when you think about it, okay, so they did it despite the American pressure. I mean, think about it. Did the US at any point, even now, want South Africa to be ruled by the South Africans, the majority? Of course, hell no. Like, the US would have loved to have Nelson Mandela dying in jail. I'm sure the US is not happy that Nelson Mandela became president. And now think about it like this. If South Africa remained racist apartheid regime, you would have no country suing the US and Israel in the ICJ. Because this case is not only about Israel, it's about complicity. The ICJ submission made it very clear. It's about indictment, relief sought for genocide perpetration, prevention, etc., but also complicity. So the US would be covered by two elements of these: the failure to prevent, as well as the complicity, which is, I think, indisputable. in many ways, not just the UA Security Council voting, but other things as well, like the military aid. So, of course, the US did not want South Africa to be free or South Africans to be free, because look at what the South Africans are doing right now. They're spreading freedom around. No, nobody wants that, you know? So, but this happened. I think this is very meaningful for us. This happened. History, like humans, we like to look at our cousins, our friends, our people that look like us, with limbs, with faces, with noses, etc. We can think that Palestinians share the same attributes of South Africa, and they will be capable at some point of getting something. It's going to be probably more painful and difficult than South Africa for many colonialist reasons related to the colonial regime internationally, but it is possible. And I would like to believe that we can do it in our generation. That's all from me.
Well, I love that. And I sometimes tell my friend who's Palestinian that when I send her a text message, I'm like, hey, we're one day closer to Palestine being free every single day.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah.
Well, Hassan, thank you so much for all of that very important context and shining a light where corporate media certainly likes to keep it dark and cold.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Where's a good place for people to keep up to date on the reports and things that Law for Palestine shares?
So I will share with you our Twitter handle, our Twitter account, as well as our website. It's law4Palestine.org. I will share both with you. We'll be uploading everything on our Twitter account as well as the website, and I would be very happy to provide you with the with the details whenever we publish something of interest to your audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you again. I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Lenore.